Sabine Pal is a social psychologist engaged in basic and applied research, and her applied work has to do with the human dimension in environmental issues. So she will now talk about the psychology of risk.
Thank you.
Sabine, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Many thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to be here to provide some insights into the human perspective on risk assessment in the sense of risk perception and risk communication when dealing with the public. Brief overview of my presentation. I don't actually come from a food background. I'm an academic who has worked on a range of environmental issues, and I have come to food risk via microplastic and plastic pollution more in marine environments, in the natural environments. So I want to start the presentation with a few examples where I illustrate some social data on this before going to a more generic perspective on the principles of risk perception, risk communication. And if there's time, I want to close with a few thoughts on science for policy, as I've been involved as advisor on various projects, and some closing thoughts. So if I start with a few examples, here's a study we actually did about microplastics in cosmetics, where we extracted microplastics from a range of products in consumption. And we invited people to the lab and asked them to handle this and to think about this microplastics in stuff, in exfoliating products they put on their faces. And then we asked them a range of questions around it. So we did this in 3 groups: beauticians, because we thought they had a really key role in cosmetic products, dealing with customers, with the public; students, because they were sort of handy, available, and they're quite educated; and environmentalists who already knew quite a lot. And the first thing to say is all 3 groups were really negative about this. They were shocked. They didn't want this on their faces or the faces of their customers. But the interesting thing for me is we then asked a range of questions around pathways. You know, what happens with these microplastics we find? Where do they end up? And the key thing to stress here is that spontaneously, without us really prompting this very much, people started talking about the food chain. So the students said their concerns about microplastics in seafood. So it goes down through the waterways, it goes into the sea, it gets eaten by the animals, and then people are eating those, etc. And that's got a negative impact. Similarly, with environmentalists, they were very informed, and they mentioned the food chain. So already in this context where we were really more interested about environmental risks and people's perceptions about those, people started talking about human health, and it's a huge emerging topic for microplastics in particular. So continuing on this thought of what's the context for this concern, I want to show you, this isn't our own work, it's the German Institute for Risk Assessment, and they run this consumer monitor where they ask people what are their concerns about a range of topics. And the key thing I want to point out here again is that microplastics are really at the top of the concern. This is 2020 data. I haven't managed to update this yet. And interestingly, already in 2020, the concern points were down by 5 compared to earlier in the year. So we might have even gone beyond peak microplastics. So it's interesting to see what people's concerns are and how high they are compared to other real risks that you probably deal with all the time. And the other interesting thing for me as a behavioral scientist is that this leads to a demand for information. So there are web pages that tell you what you can do against microplastics. So there's a demand for this information, people trying to protect themselves. And there's also increasing labeling. So at the bottom left, you get products now that say they're without microplastics. It's interesting because in this case, for example, it's still a plastic container. So this all led us to a collaboration with EFSA and with the BFR, where we asked, I've shown you data, the most recent slide was about Germany. Here's a slide about Europe, which shows that the biggest concern is in some Scandinavian countries, in Germany and in the Netherlands, and then followed by the lighter blue color. And it led us to ask, what do we actually know about public risk perception of microplastics in food in particular? And we decided to select 2 countries for comparison purposes. That was Germany and Italy, because there's a slight difference in concern here. And we had 2 phases for this project. The first phase, which I'll say a little bit about, was a qualitative phase where we did interviews with 15 respondents in each country. And we focused on a slightly broader view. So we asked about the environment, hazards to the environment from microplastics, hazards to human health, and then specifically food and drink on a range of different aspects, factors here. And if I jump right into some of these results, again, to illustrate some of the findings, some of the things people say here. The first thing to talk about is in the middle here. Some people say, I don't know what this is. I've never heard about microplastics in food or this issue at all. But they come up with analogies. They try to make sense of this new topic that is thrown at them. So they say, in this case, for example, is this similar to asbestos? Because they used it a lot and then they found it was pretty bad for health. It was carcinogenic. So they're trying to understand this issue by making comparisons. The other thing they talk about is their theories of how things might have a bad effect. On the right-hand side, I've highlighted someone saying, if you put something in a container and it might be plastic and there's liquid in it and it's really hot temperature, maybe it sort of dissolves and it ends up in the liquid. I'm not saying this is the right model. I'm just illustrating that this is what people think when they're trying to make sense of these novel risks. And then the final example at the bottom, and this is a really big, important topic, controllability. People feel that they can't really control the issue of microplastics in this case. And that's bad because they feel helpless. They look to others for guidance, but they feel they can't really do anything about it. So I think this first phase of the research is super interesting because it really gives us insight into what people think, what they perceive the problem to be, the pathways, the issues. And this is related to the methodological framework we're using, which is a mental models approach, which really helps us understand where people are coming from. How do they make sense of these issues, of these risks? And when you know that, you can use this in communications, you can use this to engage with people, and you can also use this to perhaps implement behavior change. Of course, what you've also seen here in these quotes is that mental models can be sort of unusual. They might be quite divided from reality. And we can't say that this is, most people think this or all people think this. And what we're doing in phase 2 is a large-scale survey where we ask, we've actually got the data now, but I can't present results today, where we ask a lot of people and we see what the prevailing mental models are, because that gives us a lot more confidence into the next steps. So that's the sort of examples I wanted to give you specifically on some research we've done. And to summarize this, I want to just say a few things about risk of plastic related to food in particular. I get asked quite a lot, why are people so concerned about plastic? Aren't there other more important issues? And there are some good reasons why people are concerned. And I've listed some of these factors following a paper by Jenkins et al. It's an unnatural rather than natural hazard. And people generally don't like unnatural things, particularly in food. So they have this image that if it's natural, it's good, I can trust it, it's fine. They don't like this thought of the food being tampered with, being somehow affected. It doesn't feel right. So unnatural is a big issue. Plastic is seen as very unnatural. Risk, when you look at in the media, for example, is often portrayed to affect vulnerable groups, such as babies. We've seen headlines about plastics in the placenta, etc. And this is often NGOs who use these strategies, and I'm a little bit mixed about this because it might be too alarmist and it might over-alarm people when really we don't know the evidence very, very much at the moment. There are also exposure pathways of concern. Recently, especially, we have had headlines about microplastics in food. There are scientific studies now. We increasingly have studies about microplastics in air as well, and this is very close to people's lives. It's not something they can avoid. If it's a problem in the Arctic or in the ocean far away from me, this is not so bad. But these are things directly around people. Large number of people exposed, we often hear it's everywhere, it can affect everyone. Lack of individual controllability. I showed you a quote earlier where that's an issue. And then finally, there's uncertainty and there's lack of knowledge. And again, it's difficult to know exactly what to do. It's difficult for people to know who to trust, where the uncertainty lies. And again, just to illustrate, here's an example from Canada quite a few years ago now, where media communication, or rather an NGO communication, illustrated how microplastics could go up the food chain. So this is meant to represent sushi, some microplastic particles in the middle, it's wrapped in plastic, and the message is very clear, very straightforward. And this is what people see quite a lot. So this is the context in which we're operating. For the remaining slides, I want to focus a bit more on a report we produced a few years ago for SAPEA and essentially for the EU group of chief scientific advisors, because here we discuss some very generic principles of risk perception, risk communication, also behavior change, but I'm not talking about this today. And the exciting thing about this project was that there were 3 parts and they were about equally weighted. So there was the environmental part that was about risk assessment, there were the toxicologists, there were biologists, etc., who reported on this. There was a society part, which was led by myself, and we talked about these societal issues, and there was a policy part. And it was interesting, and I really liked the way Bart Koolmans, who was the chair, approached this, because he wanted this to integrate. Of course, the evidence basis for the environment part is much, much larger than for society. There aren't many studies yet on societal aspects of, in this case, microplastics. So the environmental literature, the risk assessment literature is much, much larger. But that was, in my sense, a good approach. So if we start having another look at the risk perception part, it's important to really think about what risk perception is. So here's Paul Slovich with a quote. He's one of the really big risk perception researchers, has done this for many decades. Danger is real, but risk is socially constructed. And that's why we have all this variation. Risk perception specifically is a subjective judgment about risk, whereas risk assessment follows certain scientific rules about how you establish them. You measure certain things, you put them in relation. I don't need to tell you this because you're the experts. So when we look at risk perception, it's often the case that hazards are difficult to assess for non-experts. They're invisible. Microplastics, typically, you cannot assess for yourself. Many chemicals, many substances you can't assess. They're hidden characteristics. And that's a key thing, because therefore the public, non-experts, have to rely on experts, on trusted sources. So trust becomes absolutely central issue. And then the other issue is that experts and also different groups in society may disagree, and that causes uncertainty. People really dislike uncertainty. It's very aversive. They try to get rid of it. They try to get clarity, and it's difficult for them to deal with. And again, Slovik did an important study a few years ago, published in Science, where he said there are basically 2 factors that describe risk perception. There's the knowledge factor, ranging from known to unknown, and there's a dread factor. And basically the knowledge factor is a more cognitive, is there enough information? Do I know things about it? Is it observable factor? And the dread factor is more affective. So it's, as it says, dread, it's global catastrophic potential, the risk to future generations, the risk increasing. And they describe perception of risk, particularly this quadrant here, where things are unknown and there's high dread, are the ones that lead to high risk perception. What do people do in those situations where they don't have enough knowledge? They try to rely on other sources and on experts. They use heuristics and biases because they help deal with the complexity. And these are mental shortcuts. So it's impossible to look at all the information you've been given, so you're trying to make some rules for yourself. For example, things such as the availability heuristic. Is it easy to imagine or recall? We think for the plastic issue, this is quite important because people can imagine plastic pollution. We think about macroplastics. Compare that with climate change, which is much more ambiguous, much more complex. It's not so easy to imagine. It's getting more easy to imagine, but it's different from plastic, which is very tangible. You might get overconfidence bias, where people just rely on the existing things they know. They don't go looking further, and they think, oh yeah, I know the answer. You find confirmation bias, where once you have formed an opinion, you favor data that supports the existing views. It's really difficult to change. And also interesting, you get something called the affect heuristic. So the more negative people feel about something, the higher they think the risks are, the lower the benefits. On the converse, if you see a lot of benefit in something, say mobile phones, you're less likely to believe in risks associated with it. And in reality, there might not be any relationship between the benefits and the risks in this affective sense. But in the psychology of people, they're connected. So we said already expert and non-expert judgments can differ because they're ruled by different factors. Maybe a little bit controversially, I want to say they're equally valid if we think about risk as a societal issue. We cannot just take a top-down approach where the experts say, this is it, this is what we do. You have to have this conversation. And because of these differences, you find both social amplification of risk, where society makes it bigger than perhaps the experts think, they're more concerned. You also find attenuation, where experts say, this is a really important issue, and society says, nah, I'm not interested. And I'll show you another slide about this. And two further points about risk perception. Values matter. So people who have higher altruistic and biospheric values, they care about others, they care about nature, they tend to have higher risk perception. And the final point, beyond information, we find this quite a lot. Experts rely on information and they don't think about the values, emotions, and the identity. Now I have to probably speed up a little bit. This is a framework of social amplification and attenuation of risk, which shows what happens in society. So you've got risks and risk events. They flow into society via sources of information, via information channels. And then you've got different social stations who elaborate, who comment, who interpret this. And these can be opinion leaders, they can be government agencies, they can be the news. This again gets elaborated by individual people, stations called here, who pay attention or not, who interpret this, who use heuristics, for example. And then this leads to consequences in behavior and responses, attitude change, but also things like social protest. And overall, this whole process, if we jump right to the end, leads to impacts. And this is important because there are important things in here, such as litigation. So someone might then take companies to court because they're not happy with how they're dealing with risks, or even the claims that are made. So this is the process. Sorry, I'm making this quite short because I have to carry on. If we now think a little bit more about risk communication, it's an interactive process between members of society, between experts as well. And Bostrom, who's another important risk researcher, says everybody communicates risk. It's very difficult to control the flow of risk. There are different goals to risk communication, from raising awareness to increasing knowledge to changing behavior. And there are different levels at which you might target risk communication. So individuals, communities, to different stakeholder groups, etc. When is it effective? You can target your risk communication to make it more effective. Should be based on empirical research basis. There's a lot of research. And this point about competence and warmth is really important because experts often rely completely on competence. So they say, we have the truth, we communicate this, and that does not work well. The audience has got to have the feeling that they're respected, that they're listened to, that their concerns flow into the process. It's not just top down. And strategy and evaluation are needed here. I will skip over this very quickly. This is a classic model of communication where many things can happen between the message and the receiver that you didn't expect, perhaps. And this is how risk communication has developed over the recent years. So initially, the thought was we need to get the numbers right. We need to tell society the numbers. This is very, very top down. And it sort of evolved to the making people partners, putting all of these things together, because competence is, of course, super important. It's got to be based on the right numbers, but it's beyond the right numbers here. So you need to empower society and co-create science and questions. And I see my time is over, so I will jump over these last two slides. I can come back to them in the discussion. Oops. But this is just a few key messages. People's concerns play a key role. Understanding perceptions and behavior are really crucial. Social and behavioral sciences research can inform action to apply on these existing words and integrate things. So my appeal would be to work together. Thank you very much for listening to this Whistlewind tour.